The email arrived on an ordinary Tuesday, and it had a photograph of my own face in it, except it wasn't me. I need to start there, because that's where my whole life split into a before and an after, and I've never been able to find a gentler doorway into it. I was sitting at my kitchen table with a cup of tea going cold, doing the thing you do when a DNA testing company sends you a notification. Half interested, mostly expecting to learn I was 4% Scandinavian and predisposed to disliking cilantro. I'd spit in the little tube months earlier and forgotten about it. My husband had bought the kit as a stocking stuffer, a joke gift, and I'd done it on a slow Sunday the way you do a crossword. The subject line said, "You have a new close relative match." I almost didn't open it. I want you to understand how close I came to not opening it, how the entire shape of the rest of my life balanced on whether I clicked one gray link on a Tuesday afternoon. I opened it, and there was a photograph of a woman I had never met, next to a line of text that said, "Predicted relationship, identical twin. Shared DNA, 99.9%. I looked at the photograph for a long time. She had my face, not a similar face, not a family resemblance, the kind where people say, "Oh, you two could be sisters." My face. The exact set of my eyes. The way my mouth pulls slightly to the left. The small crease I've had between my eyebrows since I was a child, that I've always hated, that no one else in my family has ever had, because no one else in my family shared a single strand of me. Her name, the profile said, was Mara. I was 34 years old, and I was an only child, and I had just been informed by a computer that somewhere in the world there was a person who was, biologically, completely, and exactly me. I did not cry, not then. What I did was stranger and quieter than crying. I sat very still, and I felt something settle into place inside me that had been rattling loose my entire life. A piece I hadn't known was missing until it clicked home, and the click was so physical, so total, that I put my hand flat on my own chest as if to hold it there. Because here is the thing that I had never told anyone, the thing I had learned very early to stop saying out loud. My whole life I had felt like I was missing someone, but maybe it's better if I go back. Because to understand why one photograph broke me open at my kitchen table, you have to understand the word I'd been handed instead of the truth. The word they used for 30 years every single time I got close to sensing what was real. Too sensitive. I was always too sensitive. My name is Grace. I was adopted when I was 4 months old, and that part was never a secret. I want to be clear about that from the start, because it matters. My mother, Kath, the woman who raised me, never hid that I was adopted. She told me the story so many times it became a kind of lullaby. How she and my father had wanted a baby for years and couldn't have one. How they'd waited and waited and then gotten the call. How they'd driven 3 hours in the rain to a small county office and I'd been placed in her arms and she'd known instantly, completely, that I was hers. The moment I held you, she used to say, "I knew God made you for me." It's a beautiful story. I believed it my whole childhood. In a lot of ways I still do, because I don't doubt that Kath loved me. That's the part that makes all of this so hard to tell. The part that keeps it from being a simple story about a villain. Kath loved me with a ferocity that, I understand now, was the exact same thing as the lie. The love and the lie were not two separate things. They grew from the same root, and the root was fear, and I didn't understand any of that until I was 34 and looking at my own face on a stranger. But the love was real. Hold on to that as I tell you the rest, because I had to. What was not in the lullaby? What was never, not once, in 30 years of the lullaby? Was that when Kath drove 3 hours in the rain to collect the baby God made for her, there had been 2 of us in that county office, 2 babies with the same face, and she took one. I didn't know that. For 30 years, I didn't know that. But some part of me, and this is the thing I can't fully explain, the thing that people who aren't twins find hard to believe, some part of me always knew. I'll try to describe it because it's the center of everything. For as long as I can remember, I had a feeling of absence. Not a sadness exactly. An absence. Like a room in a house you've never been in but you know is there, behind a wall, because the hallway is a foot shorter than it should be. I would be in the middle of an ordinary day, a good day, and I would feel a sudden, sourceless certainty that someone was missing, that I was supposed to be turning to say something to a person who wasn't there, that a chair beside me was empty, that should have been full. As a small child, I had an imaginary friend, the way children do, except mine wasn't a dragon or a princess. Mine was a girl who looked exactly like me, and I called her by a name I'd invented, and I set a place for her at my little tea table, and I talked to her in the specific, easy, arguing way you talk to someone you've known forever. I remember my mother finding me at that table once, both cups filled with pretend tea, me mid-conversation with the empty chair. "Who are you talking to, Gracie?" "My sister," I said. "Matter of fact, the way you'd say the sky." And I remember this with the terrible clarity of the moments that turn out to matter. I remember my mother's face going strange, a flicker of something, there and gone. And then she said in a voice that was too light, too quick, "You don't have a sister, silly. It's just you and me and Daddy. You've got quite an imagination, haven't you? You're such a sensitive little thing." Such a sensitive little thing. That was the first time I remember hearing it. It would not be the last, because that feeling of absence never left me. It grew up with me, changed shape as I changed, but it never left. And every time it surfaced, every time I tried to give it words, the same door closed on it gently, with the same soft hand. When I was 9, I cried at a movie about a lost dog finding its way home, and I couldn't stop. I cried for an hour after it ended, and my mother said, "Oh, Grace, you feel everything so much. You're too sensitive for these movies." When I was 13 and I said, out of nowhere, at dinner, "Do you ever feel like you're looking for someone?" My father looked at his plate and my mother laughed and said, "Only my car keys," and then later, in the kitchen, quietly to me, "You've got to stop saying things like that, honey. People will think you're strange. You're too sensitive. You always have been. You take everything so hard." When I was 19 and my grandmother died and I said I felt like I'd been grieving my whole life and I didn't know for what, my mother held my face in her hands and said, with what I know now was real fear behind her eyes, "You have such a tender heart, Gracie. Too tender. You have to protect it. Some truths are too heavy for a heart like yours. Let me carry the heavy things." That's what a mother's for. Let me carry the heavy things. I thought that was love, and I have to keep telling you it partly was, or you won't understand how it worked. It felt like being protected. It felt like being cherished. My mother positioned herself my whole life as the guardian of my fragile heart, the one who would stand between me and anything too heavy, and I loved her for it, and I leaned into it, and I learned, slowly, completely, to distrust my own perceptions. Because that's what it does, that word, when it's handed to you enough times. Too sensitive. It teaches you that the thing you're feeling isn't real, that your instrument is broken, that when you sense something, the problem is the sensing, not the something. I became a woman who felt things deeply and then immediately apologized for feeling them. Who would notice the truth in a room, a tension, a lie, a wrongness, and then talk myself out of it because I'd been trained since the tea table to believe that my noticing was a flaw? I want to tell you what that costs, because it cost me a great deal, and it's the hidden price of this whole story. I second-guessed myself out of things I should have run from. I stayed too long in a relationship in my 20s that everyone else could see was wrong, because when the wrongness prickled at me, I heard my mother's voice. "You're too sensitive. You're reading into things." And I overrode my own alarm. I let people talk me out of my own eyes. I apologized for crying. I apologized for caring. I built an entire adult self around the foundational belief that my deepest instinct was not to be trusted. And the whole time, the absence sat inside me, patient, quiet, real. The room behind the wall, the empty chair at the tea table, the person I was always turning to speak to. She was real. She had a name I didn't know yet, and she was 34 years old, living her own life, feeling. I would learn her own version of the same absence, on the other side of a wall my mother had built and spent 3 decades pretending wasn't there. I did the DNA test almost by accident. I told you it was a stocking stuffer, and it was. But there was a truer reason I finally spat in the tube, and the truer reason was my daughter. I have a little girl. Her name is Lily. She was 6 that year, and a few months earlier her pediatrician had asked me during a routine visit about our family medical history, heart conditions, cancers, the things they ask. And I'd opened my mouth to answer and realized I had nothing to say. "I'm adopted," I told the doctor. "I don't actually know any of my biological history." She nodded, kind and unbothered, and said it was worth looking into someday, for Lily's sake, that these consumer tests could at least flag some health markers. And that landed in me and stayed, because for the first time, my not knowing wasn't only mine. It was my daughter's too. There was a whole half of Lily's blueprint that ran back through me into a darkness I'd never been allowed to look into. So when the kit showed up in my stocking, I didn't laugh it off. I did it that Sunday, for Lily, to fill in a medical form. That was all I thought I was doing. I want you to sit with the ordinariness of it. I wasn't searching for anyone. I had made my peace, or what I thought was peace, with being a person without a beginning. I loved my mother. I had built a good life, a husband who was patient with my too muchness, a daughter I adored, a small house with a garden I was slowly learning to keep alive. I wasn't a woman on a quest. I was a mother filling out a medical form. I spat in a tube. I mailed it in a prepaid envelope. I forgot about it. And 11 weeks later, on an ordinary Tuesday, a computer sent me my own face and the word twin, and every single thing my mother had ever called sensitivity revealed itself all at once to have been something else entirely. It had been accuracy. I sat at that kitchen table for a long time. The tea went fully cold. Lily was at school. The house was quiet, in the particular way. A house is quiet when your entire understanding of yourself is quietly detonating inside it. I looked at Mara's face. My face. I zoomed in on the photograph until it pixelated. I looked at the crease between her eyebrows, the one I'd hated my whole life, the one no one in my family had, and there it was, on her, in the exact same place, and I made a sound I didn't recognize as coming from me, because it was proof. Sitting right there. Undeniable, digital, 99.9% proof of the one thing I had known and been told to stop knowing since I was old enough to set a tea table. I was not too sensitive. There had been someone missing. There had been someone missing the entire time, and every adult who was supposed to love me and tell me the truth had looked at a child grieving a real absence and told her she was imagining it. The first feeling, under the shock, wasn't even sadness. I keep coming back to this because it surprised me so much. The first feeling was a kind of terrible vindication, a wild, grief-stricken relief, because a lifetime of doubting my own mind lifted in a single instant, and I understood, with my hand pressed flat against my own chest, that I had been right about the deepest thing. I had been right my whole life, and they had made me feel insane for it. And then, riding in right behind the vindication, came the question that would take everything apart. Who knew? Because a baby doesn't separate herself from her twin. Somebody did that. Somebody stood in a county office 34 years ago and made a choice about two babies with the same face, and somebody knew, and somebody had been sitting across from me at Sunday dinners for 30 years with that knowledge behind their eyes, telling me to stop being so sensitive every time the truth tried to surface. I thought about my mother's face at the tea table. That flicker. There and gone. You don't have a sister, silly. I thought about it and something cold went through me because I finally understood what that flicker had been. It hadn't been amusement at a child's imagination, it had been fear. She had walked into that room and heard her 4-year-old, who could not possibly have known, calmly setting a place at the table for the sister she'd been separated from, and my mother had been afraid. Not surprised. Afraid. You are only afraid of a child's imaginary friend if the friend is real, and you're the one who made her imaginary. I sat there and I felt 30 years reorganize themselves. Every too sensitive. Every, let me carry the heavy things, every soft-handed door closing on the truth. It hadn't been protection. Or it had been, but not protection of me. It had been protection of a secret. My mother had spent 3 decades standing guard over a lie, and the walls she'd built to hide it had run directly through the center of my life, and I had spent that life aching at the wall and being told the ache was a flaw in me. I picked up my phone. My hands were not quite steady. There was a button on Mara's profile. A little gray button that said, send a message. And there was my mother's name in my recent calls from that morning because she'd called to ask what I wanted to do for her birthday, and I'd said I'd call her back, and I hadn't yet. 2 doors. One to the sister I'd been missing my whole life, one to the woman who'd hidden her. I sat with my thumb hovering between them for what felt like an hour, and then I made the call. I want to tell you I called Mara first. It would be a cleaner story, but I didn't. Because before I could reach across 34 years to a stranger with my face, I needed to hear it. I needed to look at the woman who raised me, the woman I loved, and give her one chance, one, to finally say the true thing. I needed to ask my mother if I had a sister. And some part of me, the part that was still 4 years old at a tea table, still believed she might finally say yes. I pressed her name. It rang twice. And when she answered, warm and ordinary, "Hi, sweetheart. Did you decide about my birthday?" I heard, underneath 30 years of that voice, the sound of the wall I was about to walk straight through. Before we go on, if this story is reaching you, take a second to subscribe. It's the only way to know when the next one goes up. And if you've ever been told you are too sensitive, tell me in the comments. I read them. Now let me tell you what happened next. Did you decide about my birthday? I closed my eyes. I could see her exactly, standing in her kitchen, the yellow one, phone tucked against her shoulder, probably drying a dish. 71 years old, my mother, the woman who'd driven 3 hours in the rain for me. Mom, I said, I need to ask you something, and I need you to tell me the truth. There was a pause. Just a small one. But I heard it. After 30 years of being told my perceptions were unreliable, I had, in the space of one afternoon, started trusting them completely, and I heard that pause the way you hear a floorboard creak in a house you thought was empty. Of course, sweetheart. What is it? Did I have a sister? The silence that came back was not a normal silence. A normal silence has a texture of thinking, of not understanding, of waiting for more. This silence had a texture of a person going very still, because something they had buried for 30 years had just put its hand up through the dirt. What a strange question, she finally said, and her voice had changed. Lighter, faster. The tea table voice. Where is this coming from? Did I have a sister, Mom? A twin. When you adopted me, was there another baby? Grace. A soft exhale, patient, sorrowful, the sound of a mother about to gently correct a child. Honey, what is going on? Have you been on those adoption forums again? I've told you, those places are full of people who are hurting. They put ideas in your head. I did a DNA test. The silence again. Longer. I did a DNA test, Mom, for Lily's medical history, and it matched me to an identical twin. A woman named Mara, 99.9%. I'm looking at her face right now. It's my face. So I'm gonna ask you one more time, and I am begging you, after everything, to just tell me the truth. Did I have a twin? And do you know what my mother said? After 34 years, with the proof sitting on the table in front of me, with her own daughter's voice cracking down the phone line. She said, Grace, you sound very worked up. I think you're getting yourself into a state over something, a computer spat out. Those tests are wrong all the time, you know. There was a whole story about it. They mix people up. Now why don't you take a breath and we'll talk about it when you're calmer, because you're clearly too upset to. Don't. My voice came out low and shaking. Don't you dare. Do not tell me I'm too upset. Do not tell me I'm too sensitive. Not this time. You have said that to me my entire life, every single time I got close to this, and I am telling you right now that I finally understand what you are doing. So I need you to say it. Did I have a twin? And my mother started to cry. Not the tears of someone caught, the tears of someone wronged. That's the part I wasn't ready for. She cried the way she'd cried my whole life when I got too close to something. A soft, wounded weeping that had always made me the one apologizing, the one comforting her, the one folding my own need away to tend to hers. After everything I've given you, she wept. After a whole life of loving you, of protecting you, you call me up and interrogate me like I'm a criminal over some website. This is exactly what I always worried about, Grace. This is exactly why. Your heart, it's too much. You spiral, you always have, and now you've worked yourself into believing. I hung up. I had never hung up on my mother in my life. 34 years, and I had never once been the one to end a call. I sat there with the dead phone in my hand, and I realized that she had done it again. Even now. Even with the truth on the table with my own face on it, she had reached for the same tool, and the tool had worked for 30 years, and I could feel the pull of it even now. The pull to call back, to apologize, to say you're right, I'm sorry, I got carried away, I'm too sensitive, let's forget it. The pull was enormous. I want you to understand how enormous it was. 30 years of training doesn't lift because you saw a photograph. Every reflex in me wanted to soothe her, to take the blame, to make the discomfort go away by making myself small, the way I always had. I did not call back. Instead, I got in my car and I drove to her house. I still had a key. I let myself in the back into the yellow kitchen. She wasn't home. I'd seen on the calendar that she had her Tuesday afternoon thing at the church and she never missed it, and I'd counted on that, which tells you something about the state I was in, that I was already thinking like a person who needed evidence. Because that's what I'd become, in the space of one phone call. I'd stopped being a daughter asking a question. I'd become a woman looking for proof. She'd left me no choice. She could have told me. Standing in her kitchen, I understood that she was going to make me find it, that she would rather I dig through her house like a burglar than say one true sentence, and something hardened in me that had been soft my whole life. I knew where to look. That's a strange thing to say, but I did. There was a metal box my mother kept on the top shelf of her bedroom closet, behind the hat boxes, a gray fireproof box that had been part of the furniture of my childhood. Important papers, she always said when I asked as a kid. The deed, the wills, Dad's death certificate after he passed, boring grown-up things. I'd seen her take it down 100 times and never once thought about it. I took it down now. It was locked. And I knew where the key was too, because some things a child files away without knowing why. Taped to the underside of her jewelry box. I'd seen her retrieve it once, years ago, and my mind had kept it, the way my mind had kept the flicker on her face at the tea table, filing away evidence for a trial I didn't know was coming. My hands were shaking as I opened the box. The papers were right on top, not hidden within the hidden box. Right on top, which meant she looked at them. Which meant that all these years, while she told me I was imagining things, she had been taking this box down and looking at these papers, holding the truth in her own hands in the privacy of her locked closet, and then coming downstairs to tell me I was too sensitive. There were 2 documents. The first was my adoption decree. I'd seen a copy of it before. A plain, official thing. My adoptive name, Kath, and my father's names, dates. Nothing new. Except this was the full version, and mine had always been a photocopy, and at the bottom of the full version, in a section I'd never seen, there was a line. Siblings, 1-1, twin sister, separate placement. Twin sister, separate placement, 3 words in a government form, and my whole childhood rearranged itself around them. But it was the second document that took the ground out from under me, because the second document wasn't official. It was a letter, handwritten on the county agency's letterhead, from a social worker whose name I would later come to know well. And it was addressed to my mother, dated 4 months after my adoption, and it said, "I'm going to give it to you close to how I remember it, because I read it so many times that day that it's carved into me. Dear Mrs. I'm writing regarding the sibling of the child you adopted. As you know, the twins were placed separately due to the circumstances, but our agency's policy encourages maintaining a connection between separated siblings where the adoptive families are willing. The family who adopted the other little girl has expressed a strong wish to keep the sisters in contact as they grow, letters, photographs, eventually visits, so the girls can know they have each other. They have asked me to reach out to you to begin this. Please let me know if you would be open to it. I truly believe it's in both children's best interest. Warm regards." There was more. A follow-up clipped behind it, dated 2 months after the first. "Dear Mrs. I haven't heard back regarding my previous letter about the twins. I understand this is a great deal to navigate and I don't wish to pressure you. But I want to gently reiterate that the other family remains very open, and the window for establishing these bonds is precious. Twins who grow up knowing of each other, even at a distance, tend to do so much better than those who discover the truth later in life, often with great pain. Please do consider it. The girls deserve the chance to know they are not alone in the world." And then, paperclip to that, in my mother's own handwriting on a torn piece of notepaper, a draft. A draft of a reply she may or may not have ever sent, but wrote and kept for 30 years in the locked box on top. "Thank you for your letters. After much prayer, my husband and I have decided it's best for our daughter to have a clean start with her new family. We feel that contact with the other child would only confuse her and unsettle her. She's a very sensitive baby, and we want to give her a peaceful, secure home without complications. We ask that you close our file and that the other family not attempt to make contact. We believe this is the most loving choice. God bless you. She is a very sensitive baby." I sat on the floor of my mother's bedroom, on the beige carpet I'd learned to walk on, holding the piece of paper where she had first written the word she would spend the next 30 years using on me. She had invented my sensitivity in a letter, 4 months into my life, as the reason to slam the door on my own sister. And then she had built a whole daughter around that invented flaw, so that the flaw would explain, forever, why I ached at a wall I wasn't allowed to know was there. The other family had wanted to keep us connected. Do you understand? That's the part I couldn't hold. Mara's family, strangers, good strangers, had reached across the gap and said, "Let the sisters know each other," and my mother had reached back and said, "No, close the file," and she had used my tender heart as the reason, and she had made it a loving choice, and she had prayed about it. She hadn't stolen me from a bad situation. There was no danger here, no monster to protect me from, nothing that would have made the lie a mercy. There was only a woman so afraid of sharing me, so afraid that a sister and another family might mean her daughter's heart had somewhere else to go, that she'd chosen to give me a life-shaped hole rather than risk a single inch of me. She carried the heavy thing, all right. She'd told the truth about that in a way. She had carried it, but she hadn't carried it to spare me. She'd carried it to keep me. I don't know how long I sat on that floor. Long enough that the light changed. Long enough that I heard, eventually, the front door, and my mother's footsteps, home from the church, calling my name in a frightened voice because she'd seen my car outside and known, the way I now knew things, exactly what it meant. She appeared in the bedroom doorway. She saw me on the floor. She saw the open box, and the papers in my hands, and her own handwriting facing up. And for one moment, the mask came all the way off, and I saw the whole truth of her standing in the door. Not a monster, not a villain. A terrified old woman who had loved me so much and so wrongly that she'd amputated half of me to keep the rest, and who had known, every single day for 30 years, that this moment might come. "Grace," she whispered, "let me explain." And I looked up at her from the floor where I'd learned to crawl, and I said the truest thing I had. "You've been explaining my whole life, Mom. That's the problem. I finally read something you didn't write. I left her house that day without letting her explain. I couldn't. I wasn't ready, and I'd learned, finally, that I was allowed to not be ready, that I didn't have to manage her feelings before my own. I took photographs of every document with my phone, and I put the box back exactly where it was, and I drove home, and I have very little memory of the drive, which frightens me a bit even now. That night, after Lily was asleep, after I'd moved through the evening like a woman underwater, cutting crusts off sandwiches and reading a bedtime story about a rabbit, while my whole self came apart somewhere behind my eyes, I sat down at the kitchen table again. The same table. The scene of the crime. And I fell apart properly. I want to tell you about this because I think it's the most important thing in the whole story. More important than the reunion, more important than any confrontation. I had spent my whole life being told that my feelings were too big, that I felt things I shouldn't, that my heart was a liability, a thing that needed managing, a fragile instrument prone to false readings. And that night, alone at my table, I let the feeling be exactly as big as it actually was, the grief of 34 years, the rage, the vindication, the mourning for a sister I'd shared a body's beginning with and been kept from. I let it be as enormous as it truly was, and I did not apologize for it, and I did not make myself smaller, and I did not reach for the phone to soothe anyone, and the feeling did not destroy me. That's what she never understood. That's what the whole lie was built on. The belief that my sensitivity would destroy me, that the truth was too heavy for my heart, that I had to be protected from my own depth. And sitting at that table, feeling the single largest feeling of my entire life, I discovered that my heart was not too fragile to hold it. It was built to hold it. It had always been built to hold it. The tenderness they told me was a weakness was, in fact, a capacity, a largeness. My mother had looked at a deep well and called it a crack and spent 30 years afraid I'd fall in, when all along the depth was the point. I was not too sensitive to handle the truth. I was, it turned out, the only person in the whole story strong enough to. The next morning, I made coffee, and I sat down, and I opened Mara's profile, and I pressed the little gray button that said, "Send a message." I must have written and deleted it 20 times. How do you write to your own face? How do you introduce yourself to a person who has been missing from you since before you had language? Everything I typed was either too small, "Hi, I think we might be related," or so large it looked insane. In the end, I wrote something simple and true, and I sent it before I could talk myself out of it, and here is what it said. Mara, my name is Grace. I did a DNA test for my daughter's medical history, and it matched us as identical twins. I was adopted as a baby, and I never knew. I have spent my whole life feeling like someone was missing, and I think it was you. I don't know what you know or what you want, and I'm not asking for anything. I just needed you to know that I'm here, and that I've been looking for you my whole life without knowing your name. Grace. I pressed send. And then I did the hardest thing of all, which was wait for 2 days, nothing. 2 days in which I checked my phone with a frequency that frightened my husband, in which I lived in the specific agony of having reached across a lifetime and not knowing if anyone would reach back. I imagined every reason for the silence. She hadn't seen it. She didn't want a sister. She was angry. She was happy in her life, and I was an intrusion, a stranger with a familiar face showing up to complicate everything. I imagined her mother, the good mother, the one who'd wanted to keep us connected, and I wondered what Mara had been told, what wall had been built on her side, if any. On the third day, in the evening, my phone lit up with a notification from the app and my heart stopped, and I had to sit down before I could open it. It was from Mara, and it was long. I could see, before I even read it, that it was long, that she had written and written the way I had wanted to, and my hands were shaking so hard I could barely hold the phone, and I made myself breathe, and I opened it, and I began to read the first words my sister had ever said to me. Mara's message started with 4 words that undid me completely. I felt it too. I read those 4 words, and I put the phone down on the table, and I covered my mouth with my hand, because 34 years of being told I was imagining the absence collapsed in a single line written by the one person on earth who had been standing on the other side of it. She had felt it too. Her message was long, and I'll give you the parts that matter, because they are hers, and I want to hold them carefully. She wrote that she had always known, in some wordless way, that she was a twin, that she'd grown up with the same feeling I had, the empty chair, the sense of turning to speak to someone who wasn't there. But her story was different from mine in the one way that broke my heart open, because Mara had known she was adopted and had known she was a twin. Her parents, the family from the letters, the ones who'd reached across the gap, had told her the truth. They'd told her she had a sister out there. They'd told her that they had tried, when she was a baby, to keep the 2 of them connected, and that the other family had said no, had asked them to close the file and not make contact. I grew up knowing you existed, she wrote. I grew up being told you were out there somewhere, and that your parents had decided it was best you didn't know about me. My mom always said, when you're old enough, if you want to find her, I'll help you. But it has to be her choice too, because her family made a different choice than we did, and we have to respect that they had their reasons. I've thought about you every single day of my life, Grace. I've had a name for you since I was little. Not your real name, I didn't know it, but a name I gave you. I looked for you in crowds. I wondered if you were happy. And the hardest part, the part I could never make peace with, was not knowing if you even knew I was real. I used to lie awake terrified that you were out there thinking you were alone. When you weren't, you were never alone. I was always here. I was always here. I read that in my kitchen, and I wept in a way I had never let myself weep in front of anyone, and my husband came and sat beside me and didn't say anything, and I let him see all of it, every bit of the too muchness, and it did not send him away, and that was its own quiet lesson I was learning that week, that the people who love you rightly do not need you to be smaller. We talked on the phone that night for 4 hours. I don't have words for what it is to hear your own voice come back to you from another person, because we sounded the same, not similar, the same. The same cadence, the same way of trailing off at the end of a sentence when we got emotional, the same laugh, a laugh I'd been self-conscious about my whole life, too loud, too sudden, and there it was coming down the phone from a woman 3 states away who'd never heard me laugh before and was laughing the exact same way. We finished each other's sentences and then screamed about it. We discovered we'd both hated cilantro, both broken the same wrist as children, both cried at that same Lost Dog movie, both had the crease between our eyebrows, both had spent our lives feeling like we were missing a person. Except she'd known who, and I hadn't been allowed to. That was the thing that kept surfacing all through that beautiful, impossible conversation, the grief underneath the joy. Because Mara had spent her life missing a sister she knew was real, and I had spent mine missing a sister I'd been told didn't exist. We carried the same wound, but mine had been dressed up as a mental flaw. She'd been allowed to grieve me honestly. I'd been told my grief was a symptom. We arranged to meet 3 weeks later. She would fly to me. Those 3 weeks were the longest and strangest of my life. The anticipation of meeting a stranger who was also, biologically, the person closest to me in all the world. I met her at the airport. I had thought a great deal about that moment, how I would recognize her, and it turned out to be the stupidest worry I've ever had, because you recognize your own face. She came through the arrivals gate in a green coat, scanning the crowd, and the moment she saw me, she stopped walking, right there in the middle of the flow of people, and her face did the exact thing I could feel my own face doing. And for a second we just stood there, 20 feet apart, 2 women with one face, both. Frozen, both undone. And then we were holding on to each other, and I can't describe it, I won't even try, except to say that the hole I'd carried my whole life, the room behind the wall, the empty chair, closed. Not partially, completely. 34 years, and a lifetime of being told the hole wasn't there, and it closed in an airport in front of strangers, and some of the strangers were crying too, because there are some things the human heart recognizes even from the outside. I'd love to tell you it was all like that. It wasn't, and I promise you the truth. Reunion is not the end of the story, the way the movies pretend. Mara and I had 34 years of separate lives, separate habits, separate wounds. We were identical and we were strangers, both at once, and that's a disorienting thing to hold. There were awkwardnesses. There were moments in those first months where the sheer intensity of it overwhelmed us both and we had to pull back and breathe. We had to learn each other slowly, on top of knowing each other instantly. We're still learning. It's the great work of my life now, and it is not simple, and it is not a fairy tale. But she is my sister, and I am hers, and no one will ever be able to tell either of us again that we imagined each other. I have to tell you about my mother, because I know you're waiting for it, and because I've been putting it off the way I put off the conversation itself. I didn't speak to Kath for 2 months. I needed the distance. I needed to meet my sister without my mother's voice in my ear telling me I was being dramatic. And in those 2 months, Kath called and left messages that moved through the same weather. Every difficult thing with her always did. First wounded, then bargaining, then finally, near the end, something that started to sound like the truth. I went to see her on a gray afternoon, the yellow kitchen. The same table where she'd told me the lullaby 1,000 times. I sat down across from her, and I put my phone on the table between us, and I opened it to the photograph of the letter she'd written 34 years ago, the one that called her 4-month-old baby too sensitive, and I turned it to face her. She looked at it for a long time, and then she looked at me, and the mask was gone, had been gone since the day she found me on her bedroom floor, and what was left was just an old woman and the truth. I need to understand, I said. Not an apology, not yet. I need you to tell me why. The real why. Not the sensitive baby. Why? The real one. And she told me. She told me that when she and my father went to that county office 34 years ago, they'd been told at the last minute that the baby was a twin and that the twins were being placed separately and that they could only take one. And she said that she had held me and she had known I was hers, but that from the moment she knew there was another one of me out in the world, she had been afraid. Afraid in a way she couldn't explain and was ashamed of. I was so scared, she said, and her voice was very small. I'd wanted a baby for so long, and I'd been so empty for so long, and here you were, finally mine. And there was this other little girl with your exact face, in another family, and all I could think was that one day you'd find out, and you'd want her, and you'd want them, and you'd realize you had this whole other family, this whole other place you belonged, and there'd be less of you for me. I know how it sounds. I knew how it sounded then. When those letters came from that social worker saying the other family wanted to keep you girls connected, Grace, I panicked. I thought if you grew up knowing her, writing to her, visiting her, that your heart would always be split in two, that I'd only ever have half of you, and I couldn't bear half. I'd waited too long for a whole. So you took my sister away, I said, so you wouldn't have to share me. She flinched, but she didn't look away, and I'll give her that at the end. She didn't look away. Yes, she said, the first honest yes of my entire life. And the sensitive thing, I said, you made that up, in the letter. And then you spent 30 years using it on me. She was crying now, but quietly, the real kind, not the weaponized kind, and I could tell the difference at last. I told myself it was true, she said. That's the awful thing. I wrote it as an excuse, and then I needed it to be true, so I made it true. Every time you got close to it, every time you talked about missing someone, every time you felt too much, it terrified me because I thought you were sensing her, and you were, and I couldn't have you knowing that, so I made your knowing into a flaw. I taught you that the truest thing about you was a weakness. I did that. I took the most accurate part of you and I made you ashamed of it, and I told myself the whole time that I was protecting you. She pressed her hand to her mouth. I wasn't protecting you, I was protecting me. And I dressed it up as love for so long that I stopped being able to see the difference. I'm so sorry, Grace, not for loving you. I'll never be sorry for that. It was the realest thing I ever did. I'm sorry for what I was willing to do to keep it. We sat in that kitchen for a long time. I want to be honest about where it left us because the honesty is the whole point of why I'm telling you any of this. I did not forgive her that day. I'm not sure I've fully forgiven her even now. Some things don't get forgiven so much as they get carried differently over time. What I did do was something harder and more useful than forgiveness. I stopped needing her to be either all good or all monster. I let her be what she actually was, a woman who loved me truly and wronged me deeply, and did both with the same trembling hands and could not tell them apart until it was far too late. We speak now, carefully. She's met Lily's Aunt Mara, and watching my mother look at Mara's face, my face, the face she spent 30 years keeping out of my life, is a complicated thing to witness, grief and love and shame all sitting in an old woman's eyes at once. She is trying, in the time she has left, to know the daughter she raised without the wall between us. It is not a redemption, it's just a woman doing the small honest work she should have done from the beginning, and it's better than the lie, and it will never be enough, and both of those things are true. I don't have a tidy ending for you. I've come not to trust tidy endings, because a tidy ending was exactly what my mother tried to give me. A clean start, a peaceful home, a daughter with no complications, and it cost me half of myself. But I'll tell you where I am. I have a sister. I have 34 years to catch up on and the rest of my life to do it in, and I intend to. Lily has an aunt who has her mother's face and a laugh that makes my daughter shriek with delight because there are suddenly two of us. Mara and I are learning, slowly, the shape of a bond that was severed before we could speak and has had to be rebuilt with adult hands. It is the great and unlikely gift of my life, and I nearly never had it, because a frightened woman decided my heart was too small to hold the truth. And that's really what I've come here to say to you. That's the thing I can't stop needing to say. I've told you all of this, and I want to be honest about why. It isn't only about adoption, or twins, or one woman's fear. It's about a word. A word that got put on me before I could defend myself, and shaped the whole architecture of who I thought I was. Too sensitive. For 30 years, that was the truest thing anyone had told me about myself. And it was a lie. And worse than a lie. It was an accurate thing turned inside out and handed back to me as a defect. I felt things deeply because there was something real and deep to feel. I sensed an absence because there was an absence. My tender heart wasn't a fragile thing that needed protecting from the truth. It was a deep enough vessel to hold the truth, and the people who told me otherwise weren't protecting my heart. They were afraid of what my heart could hold, because what it could hold was them and what they'd done. So here is what I need to say to you, whoever you are, listening to this. If someone has told you that you're too sensitive, too emotional, too much, that you feel things you shouldn't, that you read into things, that your heart is a problem to be managed, if someone has made you ashamed of the depth of you, I want you to consider, gently but seriously, that they might be afraid of what you can sense, because sensitivity is not weakness. It never was. Sensitivity is perception. It is a person feeling the truth of a room before anyone says it out loud, feeling the absence behind the wall, feeling the lie under the loving words. And the people who most want you to distrust that perception are very often the people who most need you not to perceive. They told you your depth was a crack you might fall into. It was a well, and there was something real at the bottom of it the whole time. I spent 34 years being told I was too sensitive to handle the truth. And then I held the truth, the whole enormous weight of it, and it did not break me, it made me whole. It gave me back my own face and my own sister and the one thing they tried hardest to keep from me, which wasn't Mara at all in the end. It was the knowledge that I was right, that I'd been right all along, that the thing they called too sensitive was just the part of me that was strong enough to know. Thank you for staying with me until the end. If this story moved you, leave a like and subscribe so you don't miss the one still coming. And tell me, what would you like the next story to be about? I'll be reading you in the comments.